Within the Provisional IRA, there was a special formation, the main fighting unit engaged in actual insurgent warfare against the Crown. This was the East Tyrone Brigade, infamous to British security forces. At 10:30 p.m. on February 16, 1992, a stolen truck filled with volunteers rolled through the center of this village, Clonoe, on their way to carry out one of the most ill-planned actions of the Troubles. By the end of the night, the 20-year-old driver of the stolen lorry, along with two IRA gunmen, ages 19 and 21, as well as a 23-year-old volunteer who tried to flee the scene, were all dead. Two men were arrested nearby, waiting for a rendezvous, after which they were planning to act as getaway drivers. This was only the most recent of a string of ambushes in the nearby area, contacts that shook the IRA to its core. The deaths at Clonoe in 1992 cannot be understood without the context of the 1987 Loughgall ambush. I'm working on reaching out to individuals involved with the Troubles and would like to say more on the topic, but I'm afraid it's too early in my research to reveal much about that at the moment. Suffice to say that the action at Loughgall wiped out much of the militant leadership in East Tyrone, and Clonoe was the result of their much less competent successors trying to fill their shoes, younger kids trying to fit the role of revolutionaries. More importantly was the issue of guns and activity. The 1987 Loughgall ambush wiped out 9 people, including a civilian, and along with the dead was Commander Patrick Kelly, who led the brigade. Kelly pioneered new tactics of prioritizing attacks against security infrastructure over individual people, and it was clear to the intelligence community in the months after the ambush that the brigade had been totally robbed of its ability to fight for the time being. Now, this doesn't mean that it took away their leadership. To the contrary, they performed many more attacks, but the idea that Kelly had of only attacking bases was being washed away as sectarian attacks took priority. For a better explanation of the guns and activity of the people that were killed at Loughgall, I'll play this clip, but you should really watch the video I put out on the topic.
The RUC has claimed that the weapons recovered from the 8 IRA men and which were displayed yesterday in Armagh had been used in the murders of 7 people in the past 2 years.
I'm not a gun YouTuber, so I won't go into the ins and outs, but police at the time said they linked them to 7 murders and 12 attempted murders. However, documents only declassified in 2017 revealed that they had ballistics tests linking them to between 40 and 50 killings, and that these 8 guns were responsible for every single killing in the counties of Fermanagh and Tyrone in 1987 prior to the ambush. Why would you hide this fact from the public? Feeling the loss of Patrick Kelly, the Provisional IRA in the area continued a mostly hit-and-run campaign against police and military infrastructure. Nearly 100 facilities would be damaged in the half-decade between Loughgall and the ambush at Clonoe in 1992, the final result being the destruction of 33 and damage of most of the rest. The presence of the SAS was first acknowledged after the Loughgall ambush, but although the efficiency of the East Tyrone Brigade was diminished in theory, it had no noticeable practical effect on the loss of life that they imparted. To the contrary, the brigade had officially killed 7 people in the 2 years before the Loughgall ambush, but this number jumped up to 11 2 years after. Behind the scenes, the Provisional IRA were planning more well-thought-out attacks on personnel around East Tyrone, but they often took heavy losses. To win a propaganda victory, the East Tyrone Brigade went all or nothing in carrying out the Ballygowie bus bombing, an attack that killed 8 soldiers and wounded 28 more in County Tyrone. Following this, all soldiers on assignment were moved in and out of the local area in helicopter rotations. To think this happened only a year after their defeat at Loughgall, the Provisional IRA was taking a victory lap and loudly declaring the act was carried out by the Tyrone Brigade. 10 days later, on August 30th, the SAS in Drumachilly somehow managed to get intelligence to the fact that the perpetrators would be in the local area, and the Crown knew which route they'd be taking. 3 men were killed. Brothers Gerard and Martin Hart, along with their friend, Brian Mullen. This was another blow to the East Tyrone Brigade, although some sources suggest that Mullen was the only one directly involved in the bombing at Ballygowie. Next followed the infamous tit-for-tat killings that preceded the ambush at Coagh. I encountered a man related to the victims of this attack in the village of Coagh who blocked my rental vehicle with his white panel van and impressed on me how very real the history is for many people. He wouldn't tell me his specific relation to the victims, but he let me know that Coagh is a small village. When tourists roll through with Dublin license plates, photographing and filming B-roll of loyalist flags, memorials, and ambush sites side by side, it would draw suspicion from the locals. The locals would then call someone to figure out how the situation is to be handled, and I had the good fortune to meet the man who is sent out to investigate incidents like this. This is just a local, well-respected man in the village that's discouraging any trouble. As you can probably tell from my voice, I'm obnoxiously American, and Americans have something of a reputation in Northern Ireland for taking sides. But when he found out that I was actually interested in the history, he remained suspicious but told me of his murdered kin. They were shot down only yards away from where I'd parked my rental, and I had no idea about the story that preceded the ambush in the village. Sectarian killings began before the bus bombing, when the Provisional IRA shot dead Edward Gibson on April 26th. He was only 23 years old, an off-duty UDR soldier. When he was killed, he was working for the Cookstown Council as a truck driver. Attacks against off-duty UDR men became a calling card for the Provisional IRA, leading many in the local area, specifically around the Protestant town of Coagh, to assume that they were being targeted on a sectarian basis. My good friend's father was in the UDR and was nearly targeted for a similar attack years ago. One of his early memories, one that still haunts my good friend, is seeing men in the tree line at dusk. His father knew exactly what this meant. Thank God that he was never actually targeted. The UVF, a loyalist paramilitary, retaliated with a slightly more targeted killing. Phelim McNally, the brother of local Sinn Féin councillor Francie McNally. This killing came on November 24, 1988. According to the Ulster Volunteer Force, the hit was excellent. Phelim was a young local Republican, and at around 28 wasn't too young for comfort. They also knew that this man was going to be their target, and he wasn't just a random Catholic. He was the relative of someone active in the Republican political community. The IRA response came in Coagh in March 1989. This is the killing of the relative of the man who blocked my way and told me this story. All sectarian killings are reprehensible, but the murders of March 7th were uniquely so. So as I was walking around looking for the ambush site, a local man in a white panel van drove up next to me, and he said he noticed, and others in the village noticed me kind of hanging around the ambush site, and he said that the same IRA men who were ambushed there, they killed one of his relatives. Now, these three guys, in 1989, March 7th, they murdered Ernst Rankin, Leslie Dallas, and Austin Nelson. These were three older men, 72, 38, and 62. The last one was a married father of four and a lorry driver. They were right here in the automotive shop, and the IRA pulled up on them and killed them. The IRA were parked right over there, and this garden was not here, and then they escaped up this way, and this was not long before those men themselves were ambushed and killed, trying to essentially do the same thing as they entered the village from the direction of that bridge, and they wanted to kill a man who was near the toilets over there to the right, and I'll show those in the video as well. But essentially, they were just doing hit-and-run style tactics in this village several times, and the man was related to one of the victims. This maintenance garage near the town center was owned by Leslie Dallas, an elderly UDR veteran in his younger years, but now retired. He leaned against the wall outside the repair shop, chatting with two older pensioners, his friends. A truck of IRA men passed through, leaned out, and fired their machine guns at them, killing all three. The IRA claimed responsibility. They said that Dallas was a member of the UVF, but his family denied this. Even the coroner's inquest of the Royal Ulster Constabulary found that Dallas had no ties with either the UVF or with any loyalist paramilitary. As a businessman, he was affiliated, and this was well known, to the Orange Order, a Protestant fraternal society. However, killing him for being in the Orange Order would be akin to murdering a Shriner or a Freemason in the US solely on the basis that he's an older religious man who owned a business. Locals in Coagh reportedly heard the murderers shouting "Up the Rah" as they drove off, up the hill, and out of the village. The man who stopped me before I left, making sure I heard this story, indicated the attackers were the same men later killed in the Coagh ambush, which is something that is a little bit poetic, as they were killed only a few meters away from where they committed murder a couple years earlier. He naturally had no remorse and applauds the actions of the SAS in that encounter. Tit-for-tat killings, like the murder of these 3 pensioners, plagued the area around the village for some years before the ambush of June 3rd, 1991. The beginning of the end for the 3 IRA volunteers was at around 7:30 in the morning. 21-year-old Tony Doris and 39-year-old Lawrence McNally got aboard a stolen Vauxhall Cavalier in Moneymore, County Londonderry. They were joined by 35-year-old Pete Ryan, who had been on the run since escaping prison in 1981 on terror offenses. The 3 IRA men had been given some information that an off-duty UDR soldier was going to be sitting in his car by the public toilets near the bridge that leads into the village reading a newspaper. Now, that local gentleman told me it's a common misunderstanding that the SAS placed one of their own in the car right in front of the toilets here, and that's the intended target for the IRA. In reality, they put a dummy, a mannequin, and the IRA had already pulled this tactic off years prior, not too long, by coming up this edge of the village and attacking 3 men in the parking garage up there. This time, they were shot at and they careened into this wall here. According to some sources, there were rumors in the local Catholic community that their target was an associate of the Ulster Volunteer Force because of supposedly harsh treatment they were given by him at road checkpoints. However, it's important to remember that this killing came in the wake of dozens of tit-for-tat murders, and an atmosphere of paranoia shrouded most people's minds. Maybe their target looked at the wrong person the wrong way. Maybe he actually was an associate of paramilitaries. I don't know, and I'm not claiming to. Mystery still surrounds the lead-up of the Coagh ambush and the deaths of the 3 men, Doris, Ryan, and McNally. Just like in Loughgall, it's not entirely known who leaked the IRA's plan to British intelligence. Perhaps it came through barflies and phone taps. I have my own theory about who gave the tip, but without an interview and consent to mention it, I won't speculate. In any case, security forces had knowledge very well in advance that the IRA were returning to the village where they'd killed 3 Protestant pensioners not too long before. This time, they wouldn't be so lucky. The SAS had been called into the scene. The UDR soldier was given notice to stay home that day, and acting on their motto of "Who dares wins," one of the SAS men dressed as the IRA's intended victim and sat in his usual spot, pretending to wait for his friend to return home from work. Crown agents had staked out the route from Moneymore to Coagh and reported that Tony Doris was the driver. The vehicle was monitored from the air, and boots on the ground also called in their movements. They wanted the ambush to go as smoothly as possible, and that it did. As they crossed the bridge, the SAS opened up sustained automatic fire from their concealed positions. Doris was targeted first as the driver, and the Vauxhall swerved into a nearby wall, hitting 2 other cars. These are side-by-side photos. I believe them to be fairly accurate, although the sidewalk has slightly changed since the year this happened. Officially, 8 soldiers were present for the engagement, far fewer than the number at Loughgall. The operation was being watched, however, by many others as a part of a multi-agency cooperation. The IRA claimed that 2 of the men, presumably Ryan and McNally, tried to exit the Vauxhall as they took heavy fire. I find this a little bit hard to believe, with 8 SAS men from all sides shooting at them. Unofficial claims from the Catholic community stated that these 2 got away a short distance but were chased down unarmed and shot. The SAS then dragged them back. Although I won't dismiss this entirely, it doesn't seem right in context. It was partly suspicious at Loughgall with the death of Gormley, but he was some distance away from the van because he was trying to light the digger bomb. In Coagh, they were shot as the vehicle was still moving and the SAS was only feet away from their target. Over 200 bullet holes pierced the Vauxhall. The rate of fire continued until the gas tank ignited and burned all 3 men, making identification impossible by anything other than dental records. A balaclava was found a short distance away, but this might have been an attempt by the SAS to identify one of the volunteers, after which he simply tossed it aside. The 2 rifles in the car were immediately tied to the earlier murders at Leslie Dallas's garage. The mood in Coagh was naturally jubilant. 3 thugs got what they deserved. After all, these folks had murdered 3 pensioners only a couple of years earlier. The Catholic community obviously saw this in a much different light. Michael Ryan was buried in this ancient church on the western shore of Lough Neagh. The IRA operated in secret, so much of what we know about the individuals that were killed is still shrouded in secrecy, but journalist Ed Maloney claims that it was Ryan who led the December 13, 1989 attack at the Dairy Yard checkpoint. This attack alone claimed the lives of 2 soldiers, one from England, the other from Scotland, 22-year-old James Houston and 21-year-old Michael Patterson, respectively. Again, according to Ed Maloney, this was at the order of IRA Army Councilman Slab Murphy, indicating involvement with the larger Provisional IRA and not a lone wolf attack of the East Tyrone Brigade. Perhaps the balaclava was peeled from the burned face of Ryan in an attempt to see who the SAS was really looking for. After all, Ryan seemed to be the main organizer here. The next blow to the IRA would be equally as devastating. February 15, 1992, the RUC Special Branch received info, and again, this came from a mysterious source, that the East Tyrone Brigade was planning an attack in Coal Island. I'm not an expert in weaponry, but the Armalite seems to be the IRA's calling card. It's even used on many of their tombstones. This attack, however, intended to be a propaganda affair. Ditching their ARs, the IRA chose to use the DSHK Soviet heavy machine gun and 3 Romanian AKM rifles. The attack was planned for the following night, giving the Crown little time to act. Special forces carried out covert recon and warned against typical countermeasures. Security in town had been relaxed lately, and roadblocks would be met either with suspicion of a mole within the IRA or with a gun battle that may well prevent their best chance at wiping out an active service unit. Intelligence also had no idea which roads were going to be used and didn't want to stretch local resources too thin. Initially, military intelligence said the IRA plan was to meet at the Clonoe Chapel, rendezvous at the car park, and drive through the center of town. They would then return to the chapel, break down their guns, and escape in separate getaway rides. The natural first suggestion of the local police was to arrest them in town, block the vehicles before they even fired, or to snatch them as they walked through, as they often did right before an action. These ideas were discounted on the grounds that Coal Island was densely populated, and the military wanted to minimize civilian casualties if a gunfight broke out in a populated area. At 1930 hours on the 16th, the night of the attack, 12 counter-terrorist operators took up positions behind a hedgerow at the south wall of this car park. They were to wait for the initial rendezvous and not interfere if they could avoid it in any way. It's still not entirely known how many British security forces were present for this operation, but these dozen men were armed with G3 rifles and FN Mag machine guns. Unmarked cars with special forces patrolled the town throughout the night to ensure that the IRA didn't move too far outside their initial planning. At 2100 hours, 4 IRA men hijacked a Ford cargo tipper in Coal Island. The IRA had indeed been bold enough to put their own boots on the ground of the local community, enough so to carjack them right in their own backyard. The lorry owner was warned not to report the incident until after 2300 hours, foolishly giving the British a 2-hour timeline that was immediately radioed to security forces. They wouldn't need to wait very long, as a number of cars were soon seen driving in and out of the parking lot of the Clonoe Chapel. Exactly according to plan and to British military intelligence, it appears that the folks from the car lot would drive into predetermined locations in town where they would pick up the IRA men and bring them to the lorry in preparation for the imminent attack. Around this time, British forces saw white lines arching up into the sky. Not only had the IRA unwittingly given them a time frame during the carjacking, they were also short-sighted enough to use tracer rounds, basically a giant laser pointer which pointed directly back at their location. I say this from a purely tactical point of view and try to be as objective as possible. The East Tyrone Brigade's plan almost seemed intended to get them all killed. As 2230 hours rolled around, they drove the truck into the center of the village and fired 30 rounds of the 12.7mm armor-piercing tracer ammunition into the RUC base. This was, of course, the Soviet machine gun, by this point physically mounted to the back of the truck. In a style similar to the IRA's actions at Loughgall, one volunteer, in this case Kevin O'Donnell, fired the heavy gun while others laid down suppressing fire. They quickly left, not towards the church, but in the direction of Anagar Hill. Rather than notice the obviously intentional lack of pursuing vehicles, the IRA lorry continued to the home of Tony Doris, mentioned earlier, a casualty in the Coagh ambush of the previous year, and a man who carried out the murders of the 3 pensioners in the village a couple of years before that. By the time the IRA had passed his house, they were on an adrenaline high and very unobservant. They were seen waving Irish tricolors from the back of the truck and shouting, "Up the Ra, that's for Tony Doris." They then drove straight towards the car park at Clonoe Chapel. The entire attack had taken only 15 minutes and left them just 2 miles from the Coal Island police station. The counter-terrorist unit at the southern wall of the car park waited for an opportune moment for the largest number of men to leave the vehicle. As they got out to dismount the Soviet heavy machine gun, soldiers opened fire. At least some of them were SAS who used sustained automatic weapons fire as they did in Coagh. Remember I said earlier there were several live arrests, and they didn't simply kill everybody. These were the getaway drivers. They reported that British security gave no warning before firing, while the Crown reiterated that their intention was to shout a surrender order, but that their positions were given away when one of the getaway drivers shone his high beams on their position. 570 shots were fired by the British, but the IRA, who were actively in the process of loading their guns, wasn't able to fire even a single shot back. Here are the casualties. 20-year-old Patrick Vincent, the driver. He had 5 bullets in him and hadn't left the cab. 19-year-old Peter Clancy and 21-year-old Kevin O'Donnell were the 2 men dismounting the heavy machine gun. Clancy had 10 bullets in him, and O'Donnell had 2. Sean O'Farrell, age 23, had the most controversial death. Hearing the shots, he ran away from the south wall and was chased 100 yards before being shot. He had 5 bullets in him and was felled as he clambered over the fence. 2 of the getaway drivers, including a man named Aidan McKeever, were arrested. They'd been injured, but surrendered very quickly. In 2011, Northern Ireland's High Court Justice Treacy awarded a getaway driver £75,000 in damages, claiming his shooting was unjustified in the context of the ambush. 2 more strange occurrences happened that night in 1992. The IRA would later release a statement claiming that another active service unit was actively in the area and that these men got away unharmed, 4 of them. Secondly, the church began to burn. Some news outlets reported an emergency flare ignited the fuel tank, while others claimed that a misfired round did the job. Still other sources say that it could have been one of the tracer rounds fired by the IRA, who were popping a few shots off, basically doing victory laps. Much as they'd done in the Coagh ambush, local Catholics claimed that they'd seen some men captured and summarily executed by the SAS. More news came in 2025, courtesy of Justice Humphreys of the High Court of Northern Ireland, that the actions of the British Army were unjustified. At some point during the inquest, one of the soldiers claimed he'd been fired at. In reality, being blinded by a getaway driver's high beams, hearing the crackle of gunfire and seeing men handling guns directly across the lot would probably make most men fear they were being shot at. In any cases, charges have been brought against the counterterrorism operators that were present on that night. And in the shadow of the Clonoe church behind which the Clonoe ambush took place, you've got a monument to Gerard Coney, who was killed in 1974, escaping from Longcash, a prison up here. And just behind me now, you've got the grave. It would have been fascinating to talk to this man, Eddie O'Neill. He was a Irish Republican socialist. His grave reads, ex-POW anti-fascist president of FIBI, unbroken socialist Republican. The Irish people will only be free when they own everything from the plow to the stars. That's a quote by James Connolly. I explained a little bit more about it at the grave of the man who organized the Irish Republican Socialist Party and the Irish National Liberation Army. And this is a local monument to the East Tyrone Brigade, widely regarded as some of the fiercest fighters in the Irish Republican movement. You've got graves from, or at least memorials to, several different people here. Brian Campbell was shot by the SAS in 1983. Peter Clancy was also shot by the SAS in 1992. John O'Neill was shot by the Special Constabulary in 1921, a very early death in the Irish Civil War and then the Irish War of Independence. In Northern Ireland, that was the same thing. You've got here a recent death, someone who died of old age. He was a counselor with Sinn Féin up until 2001, and he died in '06. Kevin Kilpatrick was murdered by the Ulster Defence Regiment in 1973, and Gerard Coney was killed while escaping Long Kesh, and he's actually the one buried here on the opposite side of the monument. And again, right behind it is the church that saw the Clonoe ambush, probably the biggest defeat for East Tyrone Brigade. Meanwhile, back in '92, the IRA was reeling from these failures. The ambush at Loughgall arguably destroyed their fundamental targeting capabilities, and they shifted away from strictly infrastructure and towards more tit-for-tat sectarian killings. The Coagh ambush killed veteran members of the East Tyrone Brigade and instilled a deepening sense of paranoia about a mole within their ranks. Finally, this action, intended as a rebel memorial for a casualty in the latter ambush, failed on so many tactical levels. Most glaringly, the Soviet heavy machine gun could have been used at a range of up to 2 kilometers, meaning they could have probably shot at the police station from atop a nearby hill. Their use of tracer rounds also immediately revealed exactly where they were in town. They also seemed to not have an escape route planned, and their following vehicle had its hazard lights on. The Provisional IRA's East Tyrone Brigade casualties were praised in the Republican community as martyrs, but mistakes were acknowledged internally as the East Tyrone Brigade shifted gradually to more mortar-reliant tactics.